to today's webinar, Supervision for Children's Wellbeing. My name is Dan Moss, Practice Development Manager at Emerging Minds. Recently, Emerging Minds worked in partnership with the Bouverie Centre to deliver an online course that helps supervisors to have effective and supportive child-focused conversations with the practitioners that meet with them. That course can be found on the Emerging Minds website at www.emergingminds.com.au. So we've got some great panellists to meet today, but before we do, I'd like to recognise and pay respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the traditional owners of the lands where we work, play and walk on throughout this country. We acknowledge and respect their traditional connections to the land and waters, cultural, spirituality, family and community for the well-being of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and their families. So today's webinar is part of a partnership series that is co-facilitated between CFCA and Emerging Minds, focusing particularly on infant and children's mental health. Today we'll be considering how children's mental health can be affected by the supervision processes that we work through to make sure that all practice is attending to children's social and emotional wellbeing needs. These processes are possible in supervision with practitioners who are working primarily with adults or those who are working primarily with children and families. And a big thank you to all of you who have submitted your questions. We've got well over 100 questions and we'll do our best to incorporate as many of those as we can in our conversation with our panelists today. We did get quite a few questions on professional supervision for practice with specific populations, and I don't think we're going to have time to go into those or give them the attention they deserve today, but we have noted those questions for future resources, so thank you. So before we get into our discussion, just some quick housekeeping. Please send your questions, so keep the questions coming through via the questions box in the GoToWebinar dashboard for the live Q&A session. Just to let you know, this question will be recorded, it is being recorded and will be available about 2 weeks after this broadcast. You can check AFS News or the AFS website under the webinar banner to find the recording. In the handout sections of your GoToWebinar control panel, you will find some of the resources that we'll be discussing or others that relate to the topic. When the webinar finishes, or if you leave early, a short feedback survey will open in the new window. We really appreciate your feedback and we're always working to improve what we do with you. So, now it's time to welcome our fantastic panellists. So really looking forward to talking with Julia Oxley, Joanne Dunn and Catherine McLean today about their supervisory experience, particularly in child-focused ways. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
I'm going to start with you, Joanne. You've got significant experience in teaching supervision practices. I want to know, can you tell us a little bit about this and the strategies that you provide in this work?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. There's probably 3 or 4 main things that I'd like to focus on, especially with new supervisees or people who are starting out to be a supervisor for the first time. So first of all, we have to remember that supervision is a part of our accountability with our work with clients. So ultimately, supervision should help us in our work to get better outcomes for the client. So we often start with what we call a supervision contract or a supervision agreement that helps both the supervisor and the supervisee understand and negotiate roles and responsibilities. We would talk about some of the tricky things, like if your supervisor has a dual role, they may be your manager or a team leader, how might that affect your relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee, and how can we talk about any worries that you might have in that aspect? The second component, is obviously learning and professional development. So I think at the start of a supervision relationship, some really nice engaging questions are, if you were the caseworker, the counsellor that you aspire to be, how would you like to describe yourself? Or if you had a past client that you worked well with sitting here with us today, and I asked them, what was really helpful about your work with Joe? What might they say? We talk about what does high support and high challenge mean for you in supervision. We talk about how you like to give and receive feedback. And then obviously around all of this is the element of support, because supervision isn't going to go anywhere unless there's psychological safety. So I might say things like, I'm hoping that we can really learn from each other. I'm not the font of all knowledge. I'm really interested in learning with you, as well as helping you achieve your learning goals. And focusing on understanding what's been helpful and unhelpful for the supervisees in the past. And around all of this conversation is obviously the culture of the supervisee, the supervisor, and the culture of the organisation. Also looking at basic things like, what does confidentiality mean for us both? What are the limits of that in the organisation? So there's some of the basic components that I would start with when we're starting a supervisory relationship.
Thanks, Joanne. I'm really looking forward to hearing a bit more about that later. Catherine, you've got lots of experience in supervision and also working with other organisations around supervision. What are some of the strategies you have seen or used to support child-focused practice?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Look, just to move to segue on from all the beautiful comments from Joanne, I think really what's most important is establishing the relationship, right from the outset, because without that safe and trusting relationship, practitioners and even supervisors will be challenged to critically reflect in an open manner. And so some of the ways we can do this is by really engaging with supervisees from the heart and not just from our head, recognising that we're all actually here with a shared purpose of trying to improve the lives of the adults, children and families that we're serving. So trust and safety, psychological safety, as Joanne's just mentioned, it's so important, because supervision really is a safe space to share vulnerabilities, and that's going to, likely bring things up for people. So we really want to make sure we're creating a safe container for them to do that. And so some of the ways I've helped to foster that in supervision is really by naming a few things really early on. Things like, it's okay to make mistakes. You don't have to follow this rule book as such. We just need to remain open to reflection and ask the supervisee what their previous experience with supervision has looked like. How have they taken on feedback in the past, and perhaps what have they found useful or perhaps not so useful. And in addition, I guess what I would also be focusing on is asking about their strengths. How might they already be practicing in a child-focused way that we can draw on and build from there. We don't want to make any assumptions that people don't already have the resources within them. So also, if I was noticing any resistance from the practitioner perhaps around their level of comfort with child-focused practice, I would be really gently naming that early on, saying things like, I'm noticing a shift in your body language, or I'm wondering if this is an area that you're experiencing discomfort around, and perhaps we could spend some extra time unpacking it so I can better support you. These are all things that we really just need to be able to lean into as supervisors. Also, another great strategy for child-focused supervision is for the supervisor to bring the child's experience into the room. So we can do this by reflecting genuine curiosity and asking questions like, what do you think little Johnny might be seeing, hearing and feeling? How can we create opportunities to bring his voice into the room when you meet with his mum next? And so if we are a collaborative partner with the practitioner, then that way they can actually experience the embodiment of this and in turn use that approach in their work with clients. So I also want to mention the Emerging Minds children's wellbeing supervision course that you've just mentioned, Dan, really does dive into this subject with a lot more detail. And so anybody that does want to explore some of the ways to incorporate child-focused practice, please do go to our website and have a look for that course for further guidance.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Now, Julia, you've got a wealth of supervision experiences, both in adult and child and family services. And so I'm wondering, what are the strategies that you use to build strong supervisory relationships that I suppose allow for that safe and critical reflection?
It's interesting. I kind of echo exactly what Joanne and Catherine have already mentioned. And while they were talking, I was thinking a lot about my own experience as a new supervisor, as well as a more established supervisor. And a lot of the work that you do in supervision echoes and parallels the work we do in work with our clients. And I think so does a lot of our skills. But I think the big difference is how we use ourselves in supervision. And I want to be able to be a bit more kind of transparent in how I work in my supervision. And I personally use a lot of my own examples of maybe when I've been struggling with things and showing some sort of vulnerabilities that in my work as well. And I think that helps model some of the work that you want to be able to kind of allow for the supervisee to be able to bring to you as well. So I know, Joanne, you mentioned something earlier on about, depending on the stage of supervision. So if it's an early practitioner, you might need to do a bit more work in building that up. I mean, people often value supervision and really do want, a good, safe space to be able to reflect in. And so you need to couple that support with criticism. I mean, I think people, when I say criticism, critical feedback, critical reflection, and you need to be able to develop that trust to be able to get to that point. So acknowledging that might take some time to get there, that use of self, that kind of showing some vulnerability of, when I first started working this area, I wasn't quite sure, I wasn't quite confident how some of the strategies I might have used, I might share with my supervisor as well, with the idea that the paralleling of the processes can kind of filter down when you're working with a consumer, a client. You want to be able to, for them to be able to have some of that safety as well. So, exactly what Joanne and Catherine were saying, you want to be able to get to the point of developing goals, but commonly the goals are fairly common. People do want space to be able to have some feedback, some critical feedback, but to be able to get to that, it's really kind of working up to that space. So it's really balancing that support and challenge aspect, kind of getting to those goals. And I find I share a lot of myself in that space too. So, which probably is the bit that differs a little bit. I share myself differently in my client work. So I think it's a slightly different relationship with that. But yeah, that's some of the things I might consider.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Julia. And I wonder whether I might ask you another question. And as mentioned, much of your work has occurred in adult-facing services. Yeah. And sometimes adult clients might not always have traditionally been asked about their parenting status in those services. So what's been important for you in establishing the expectation of child-focused questions, both in practice and supervision?
It is an interesting question because I think it's often an area where people don't feel confident in adult services with adult clients. I think I often start gently with being able to just kind of bring up that idea of your client being a parent and exploring with that supervisee what that might mean for the consumer, maybe what they think they might need to do with that. Also exploring alongside that what that means in an adult-focused service. So what is the expectation of how they bring this work to kind of, how this relates to their work, really. And I think that can be quite an interesting question to ask, because I think sometimes in my experience, people haven't always wanted to ask the questions because they don't know what to do with the answer. So it's a bit of a, what if I open Pandora's box and there's all these things around the child that I need to then address? but it might also be worthwhile to go back and say, well, what does the organisation expect of you here? Is it just that you want to be able to kind of honour the parenting role? Is it that it can be a point of kind of getting in other help? It's about reassuring the clinician or the worker that you're working with that they don't have to necessarily address everything, but that there is a responsibility that they kind of at least be aware of what are the issues for the parenting that might be pertinent to the consumer, whether they have to do everything about that or not. So the other thing I think I often reflect on is for parents, whether they're people in services or not, their parenting is a big role in their life, and it's something that's often very meaningful for them. So I think if we're not honouring that in their life, that we're missing a big chunk of their life. And I think that often really does align with consumers' goals. So it doesn't sort of fit out of, it's not out of kilter with the work that we're doing in an adult focused land, which is around where they want, what they want to be doing in a recovery focused kind of way. So I think that could be quite consistent with the work that they do in other aspects of a consumer's life and supporting recovery focused practice. So really just kind of bringing it back into some of those basics as well. And often that the consumer can be quite afraid to bring up concerns they have around parenting. So we may need to, support, and that almost parallels, like what I was saying before, parallels the work that we're doing with our consumers, that the supervisor's afraid to bring it up and the consumer's afraid to bring it up, so it just doesn't get spoken. So allowing the clinician or the practitioner to approach that gently and to acknowledge some of those concerns and to almost preempt some of the worries and the anxieties around that. So you're not just looking for risks and kind of going to rush to authorities around, any concerns that might come up, but it's just exploring and again, allowing that trusting relationship for the supervisee to have with their consumer. Yeah. Thanks,
Julia. Joanne, Julia's obviously talking about adult-facing services, but in services which are more oriented towards children and their families, there can sometimes be this sense of a pressing need for parents to change. This might position practitioners in a more authoritative or directive position. So in your experience, what has worked in supporting practitioners to work with parents in supportive ways, but while still keeping the child's needs in mind?
Yeah, look, I think it needs to be acknowledged that it's hard. This is hard work that we're doing. We're dealing with a lot of trauma, sometimes a lot of conflict between parents, sometimes very high distress. So it's hard for both, newer and experienced workers, and it can be frustrating when, if you're working with the child, you really want to ensure that child's voice is heard when you're with the parents and the child isn't in the room. But one of the things that, for me, I find that is really helpful when I'm in that space is to hold on to the thought that most parents are doing the best that they can in their parenting of the children. And if they're coming in to the room for a counselling session, or if you're visiting them in their home for an outreach visit and they are welcoming you there, that's actually a huge step. So I think that's really important to remember. And if we hold on to that assumption that, these adults are doing the best that they can at this point in time and are asking for help, it really helps us position ourselves in a space of curiosity rather than judgment. And it really reduces the possibility, like Julia has just said, that we're going to be taking on a more authoritative and sort of teaching role to the parents. So if we can really take on that position, that helps us address the constraints that the parents are experiencing. So we need to identify what's getting in the way for them to be the parents that they really do want to be, and work in ways that reduce their fear of being shamed or blamed. And I might ask some questions about, tell me about the qualities that you most love about your child, and where do you think those qualities develop from? And how might both of you have contributed to that? So like what both Catherine and Julia were saying about the importance of trust and engagement in the supervisory role, it's the same with our role with parents. Even if the child is our main client, we need to get parents on side. So having that belief that parents are doing what they can, being curious and addressing the constraints of the parents, I think will get them on side so that they know that they're not being spoken at, but, you know, we are working with them.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Joanne. Catherine, what are some of the effective supervision strategies you've observed in your experience, which help practitioners to have sensitive and respectful conversations with parents about how their experiences of adversity might be affecting their children?
Yeah, look, I think it's such an important thing that we just have these conversations in the first place, because it really does speak to what Julia was mentioning about, you know, the fact that the parenting role is often the strongest motivator for change, but yet practitioners at times are not actually asking about that. And from our work at Emerging Minds with child and family partners, they're saying we want people to ask us, you know, don't be afraid to ask us about our relationship with our child. So I think it's just so important that we give ourselves permission to lean into this, because it's what parents are actually wanting as well. So I guess for me as a supervisor, I really do believe that we have an opportunity and a responsibility to model to supervisees what curious, respectful and considered questioning really looks and feels like. Remembering that for some staff, they are new to receiving supervision and they may also be new to the field. And so they really do look to the supervisor as a role model for how to effectively implement those relational strategies and interventions, and some of which have come directly from that safe container of the supervision relationship. So the way that we ask questions about the parent's own parenting journey, as well as their experience of being parented, the warmth in our tone, the empathy we display, our ability to convey non-judgment and acceptance of their experiences, both the client and the supervisee, as well as that curious line of questioning, this all models ways of interacting with staff that then transfers to how practitioners can engage with parents to support children's wellbeing. Because we really can't expect practitioners to uphold child-aware practices if we ourselves are not fostering them within supervision, alongside that safe container built around mutual trust and respect. So Emerging Minds does have a couple of really useful resources for this line of questioning. So these are available in the handout section, I believe, for anybody that's watching. So a couple of the things that I want to make mention of is our practice positions. So these were designed for practitioners. However, they are highly transferable and they are the foundation for quality supervisory child-focused practice too. So they reference things like respect and curiosity and hopefulness and what this really looks like in practice. And in addition, included within that same handout that we've made available for you is what's known as our PERCS guide. So they are a series of example questions that can be used as a guide to support conversations with parents and carers about the impacts of adult adversity on children's wellbeing. So these guides can be used in supervision as well to help unpack the possible experiences for children, as well as helping practitioners to potentially role play or further explore practical ways of engaging parents in those conversations about the impacts of adversity on children.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Julia, as Catherine mentioned, you know, some practitioners that supervisors meet with might be very new, or you know, in adult-focused services, they might find this idea about child-focused practice new or even daunting. How do you overcome that, and what engagement strategies have you used?
You know, it's interesting, and I'm thinking a bit about what Catherine and Joanne were both saying. So just to kind of ride off these coattails of what you both said, I think it's almost worth exploring the practitioner's own value system around this. So, you know, that idea that you were mentioning, Catherine, about inadvertently what message is coming across in their tone or their delivery is just as important as the words. We all know that in the work we do with our clients, and I think that's really kind of worth highlighting. And it kind of echoes some of those things you're saying too, Joanne, about that idea that our beliefs behind our work really do inform how we come across. So if we're, but I think in supervision, you've got a lovely opportunity to kind of really explore and almost gently challenge some of those things that if people are inadvertently, without even knowing it, coming across thinking, I'm here to find what's wrong, because that's often what clinical services and other services do. They come because the person's come in distress and things are going not so well in their life. And it almost sounds counterintuitive to kind of look at strengths. And I mean, we know we should, we're not trained to do all that, but to really look at the assumption that a family is doing the best they can do, but that they're stuck and they come here for help, just really does change how we, and can help challenge some of our kind of ideas. And I think the other point I want to make was, when I came into this work as a new clinician, I wasn't a parent. That was really scary to be able to ask about someone's parenting, because I'm thinking, I don't have any idea what authority have I got to be able to advise, help, give suggestions. I have no idea. So I think it's about building up the clinician or practitioner's toolbox, having some of those questions that, you know, you talk about, Catherine, to be able to kind of just gently ask, but beyond that, what do you need to do with that? So you can almost kind of model some of that, sort of practice, rehearse some of that in supervision. So exploring those kind of underlying values and assumptions that are potentially going to be more helpful. The client's sensitive. They're going to know when we're looking for kind of slip-ups. I'm now a parent. I know that when people give me advice, my mum default kind of line is always going to be, oh, are they criticizing what I'm doing? So we do need to be super sensitive in how we deliver that. And I think supervision is a lovely opportunity just to be able to explore that and own it. I mean, I don't know all the answers as a supervisor, like you're saying, Joanne. Actually helping the supervisee to also hold that position of not necessarily knowing everything, but helping their client, their consumer, to help explore and understand things a bit better is probably the most effective thing they can do. But you need to have a bit of a leap of faith to be able to do that. So you kind of, again, parallel and modeling some of that. And again, going back to my earlier point, you know, talking about times when I didn't always know all of this was really can be really helpful for supervisees to think, oh, good, I can start practicing and exploring some of these things from an early kind of practitioner sort of point as well.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Catherine, obviously part of your work at Emerging Minds is working with organisations to consider strategies for child-focused practice. And in terms of child-focused supervision, what can organisations, or what do organisations do to ensure that this supervision occurs consistently and effectively, and transfers to practices outside of supervision too?
Yeah, it's a great question. So firstly, I'll touch on, I guess, the need for child-focused supervision to be prioritised, you know, and not placed on the back burner for what may often be perceived as more pressing matters. So this really does need to come from the top down, where an organisation both gives permission and creates space and time for this commitment to be made and to happen at regular intervals. So not all organisations, unfortunately, have strong supervision systems in place, and the implementation of it is often left to individual team leaders. And consistent practices and processes then for recording and reflecting on previous sessions, it's just so important for continuous improvement and accountability, particularly if a supervisee feels they're not receiving consistent or effective levels of supervision to support their practice, then they're just not well supported. But if they've got policies and things in place that they can actually then raise this with HR, and they know that their organisation has made a commitment for this to occur, then they've got something to actually support them. So this also ensures that, you know, organisations are held accountable to training their supervisors in effective supervision practices and not just leaving it to chance, which often, again, does happen. So if you're an organisation that includes both clinical and operational supervision into one session, it's also useful to consider using a template, for instance, that guides you to keep on track with key areas of focus, so as not to lean more heavily to the operational side, which often does happen in our busy NGOs, is that, you know, the demands, I guess, of, you know, the operational matters actually take precedence a lot more than reflective clinical supervision. And I think it's important that we name that. So the other part I also wanted to speak to about this question, I guess, is, you know, what happens outside of supervision? Because Effective child-focused practice begins in the organisation with its values, its culture, its policies, its procedures, its intake processes, and the service offering, in general. These all need to be focused on an awareness of the experiences of children, regardless of whether they are the primary client or not.
Yeah.
And it can even be helpful to develop a sort of reflective checklist within your organisation, something to consider, how do our policies and processes and frameworks reflect children's voices, their right to be heard, whether we're working directly with children or not? How do our intake processes, for example, ensure that we're asking the right questions to determine the experiences of adult parents? How do our practices reflect the needs and aspirations of children from their perspective? So these are just some of the practical ways that organisations can consider the important role that they play in supporting early intervention approaches towards improving children's wellbeing.
Yeah, great answers there. Thanks, Catherine. Joanne, just continuing on from what Catherine's saying there, in your experience, what can organisations do to support supervisors to provide good supervision?
Yeah, so I'll just echo once again what Catherine has just said, Dan, and that is to ensure that both the supervisor and the supervisee have no guilt in scheduling regular times in their diaries. And look, we are all very, very busy. We are all dealing with waiting lists. We're all dealing with lots of organisational issues and client crises. However, I like to think of practice supervision, clinical supervision as our oxygen. It's our oxygen cylinder. And we need that oxygen regularly to sustain us in our work. So the organisation needs to allow diaries to reflect, and not just to reflect, but expect that supervision does take place. It should be also outlined in the supervision contract that I mentioned earlier when a new supervisory relationship is happening. I also think that having a space for supervisors to meet together, so supervision for practice or clinical supervisors that can be in a group setting can be a really important space, not to be sharing what my supervisor said or did, but what are the issues for me that I'm struggling with as a supervisor when this situation comes up a lot for me? So a little bit of a parallel process in what we're doing with our supervisees. Doing that in a group with other supervisors can be a really useful idea. So I would invite organisations to think about how they might do that, or how they might partner up with other organisations. If they're in a rural community or a remote community, are there other organisations in the region that could partner up with that? I think the other idea when we're talking about organisational support is to have a formal expectation that there is an annual supervision review between the supervisor and the supervisee. And of course, once again, this shouldn't be like a school report. I know at RASA we have a formal document, but it's a document that really facilitates conversation. What's been the highlights, for you this year in terms of your practice? What are some of your learning edges that you think we need to continue to work on? And how do you think we're going together? Have there been times when I, as your supervisor, have dropped the ball a little bit? Have I been too challenging, or has there been times when you would have wished I had pushed and challenged you a bit more? So I think those conversations are really, really important, and that it really adds to a trusting and a really robust relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee. But I think the organisation needs to have an expectation that there is both the time for those regular supervisions to occur and regular reviews of the supervision to occur as well.
Thanks, Joanne. Julia, In our online course, Supervision for Children's Wellbeing, you talked a little bit about the importance of accountability and supervision. So as a supervisor, how do you provide both support for the practitioner but also accountability within supervision?
Yeah, it's a big word, accountability, and it sounds a bit daunting because I think we often kind of have lots of things we're accountable to, and supervision as a process is a process of accountability as well as having accountability within supervision, I think. So I think there's a number of layers to think about that comes to mind for me, and touching a bit on, again, Catherine and Joanne, just to kind of, feed off what you said, that you've got accountability to your client ultimately, and that is should be kind of part of the supervision's role, and that's what's one of the goals and the content that you're going to be covering over in supervision, and issues that might come up that you have concerns around practice is really around practice to be able to provide the best care for our clients, really, and what you do about that as a supervisor really does depend on your role, whether you're line manager or professional supervisor, and might be needs to be covered off in things like contracts. So what happens when I have got concerns? How do we address it? How do we escalate that? That's one of the things that I think about. There's also organisational accountabilities, and I think was mentioned before about that kind of competing role sometimes, and sometimes it does feel competing when you've got line management and clinical or professional supervision that's happening together. And how do you juggle the expectations and the accountability of the organisation and to your supervisee can get really tricky. And I think you touched on that earlier, Catherine. And certainly there's no easy answers to that. If it's all going swimmingly and smoothly, then great. But I think sometimes it's really important to put some preventative strategies in about that. So whether it's some sort of structure that was talked about earlier, or being really clear about, as your line manager, I need to let you know about X, Y, Z. And now I'm going to, be really clear about what role you're taking in that supervision can be another way of being really holding both roles in mind. Ideally speaking, you're not necessarily going to want to mix the two, but some organisations, you don't have a lot of choice about that. But having said that, I think accountability can be hard when you're a clinical supervisor and you don't have that line management responsibility, and you need to kind of address some concerns you have in practice, and how you might handle that, and where that gets escalated to can also be challenging. So I think they're really important processes to be upfront about with your supervisee and within your organisation. And sometimes those things that come up that in clinical supervision do pertain to kind of risks to clients and those sort of things, as well as poor practice. So it's just about being really clear about what the responsibility is for the practitioner, what needs to happen, all those sort of things you kind of need to be clear about as a supervisor, about the roles and responsibilities. Again, I think the idea of accountability is, prevention is better than kind of the cure, and being really, and how you set that up is kind of the key to success sometimes. And just keeping in mind that your ultimate responsibility, you are ultimately, and I think someone mentioned this earlier, you're ultimately responsible to the clients of our service. So all of these structures and supports and processes really do honour what our consumers and clients want and need, and has to happen to keep them safe.
So you're really starting to talk about the kind of some of the micro skills in supervision there, particularly around reflective practice, and all three of you have spoken a little bit about reflective practice today, and we've got a host of different questions coming in from our audience on reflective practice, so we might get a little bit into that now. I might start with you, Joanne, and ask if you can describe the importance of reflective practice in supervision, and how can this help practitioners who might be feeling stuck with children or families?
Yeah, so reflective practice, I think, is it's utterly essential. As a number of people have said, this is hard work. We are in situations where our own buttons might be pressed, where we feel triggered about what our clients might have said. So we need to have a safe space in order to unpack what is it that's triggering me, and how am I going to be able to stay connected and contain and maintain focus on what I need to do with the child or the parent. So, you know, the concepts of, you know, Michael Carroll's, that the reflection on action, you know, in supervision. So, you know, what was done? Can you tell me a little bit about, you know, where you were heading when you were asking that line of questioning? Were there things that you would like to have said? You know, what was happening? What did you notice about yourself, you know, in the session? Reflection in action. So as we talk about this now, what's happening to you? What are you leaning in towards, and what's making you draw away from these particular questions? And then there's reflection for action, and that's what ideas after our conversation today will you be taking into your next session? So if you notice, these are all questions that are not coming from the supervisee in a position of being expert, but gently facilitating and challenging the supervisee to be thinking about, well, yeah, what was it that made me not go down that particular line of questioning, even though I realised I should have actually noticed that Dad turned away when we talked about X, Y, and Z. What was it about that that made me not do that? You know, reflective questions help us to consider what our own personal beliefs and assumptions are and what our trigger points are. So I just think it's really, really important. You know, we often use the high support, high challenge matrix, and I quite often, in the middle of a supervision, I might just say, so where are we at the moment in terms of support and challenge? Am I giving you enough challenge alongside enough support? The supervisor, you know, may say, well, actually, I'm finding this pretty confronting at the moment, and I might think I'm being very gentle. So we need to calibrate and continually check in with our supervisees how much we can invite that reflection and what their limits are. But at the same time, supervision is also about learning and developing and making mistakes and learning that, as Scott Miller says, how to fail successfully. And I remember I was in a session with a girl, she was about 8, a little girl, and she was telling me about something that went wrong at school, and she mentioned the word fail. I said, oh, so you thought it was a fail? And she said, yes, with this big smile on her face. And I said, oh, you're smiling when you say that. And she said, oh, Joanne, don't you know what fail means? And she said, first attempt in learning. And I just thought that was brilliant. And I think if we can have our supervisions to reflect, yeah, these are first attempts in learning for both of us sometimes, that's terrific. There's a couple of very practical resources that are easily available on the net, and that's the Supervision Toolkit with Dorothy Hewson and Michael Carroll. And I also make use of Vicki Reynolds' Zone of Fabulousness and Zone of Balance, which invite a lot of reflection in both an individual context and a group context as well.
Thanks, Joanne. Catherine, we've talked a little bit about new practitioners, but there's probably some fairly new supervisors watching today. And for those new supervisors who might not be as confident, what might you recommend to support their practices?
Yeah, so like I think this is a lot more common than we realise, and I think it's important to again, you know, speak into this, because we all have to start somewhere. And I just love that that quote from that little girl, Joanne. It was just beautiful. So I think, yeah, taking that sort of approach around failure, we really just need to be, you know, recognising that we're all learning. We've all got to start somewhere. And I guess, you know, for practitioners, often, they are promoted to the role of supervisor because they have demonstrated quality practice. But, often at times they're not always supported in how to transfer those skills into a supervisory relationship. And often they're doing that with people who used to be their peers. So I guess the first thing I would say here is ensure that the supervisor has access to quality supervision themselves, and really to use that space to lean into the edges of discomfort that they may be feeling, and to know that supervisors, they also struggle with feelings of, am I doing it right? And because of that, they need to debrief. So they need to keep their supervisory relationships really clear, I guess, of that projection and potential miscuing that can occur if they don't have a safe container themselves to debrief with their supervisors. So I guess the other thing I'll also make mention, again, I've been plugging Emerging Minds all day today, so I'll keep going, is that we've got a couple of really great courses that I really would recommend for any new supervisor. I mean, there's a whole host of courses, truly, but one of them would be Child Aware Practice, as really as a foundational learning for anybody that's new to, not just, anybody, I guess, that's new to child aware practice, because really it's the foundation. And as I was mentioning before, we need to make sure as supervisors that we actually have enough skills and experience and know-how to be able to speak to and communicate about the topics that we're wanting our practitioners and staff to also embody and grow and learn through as well. So yeah, the Child Aware Practice would be a great foundational learning course, as well as, of course, the Supervision for Children's Wellbeing. Both of these would help scaffold an understanding and knowledge base, and really make for robust discussions within the relationship with their supervisor. And obviously both of those courses are on our website.
Great, thanks, Catherine. We love an Emerging Minds plug, so well done. I'm going to now move into the live Q&A, because we've answered some of your questions, but we've got a whole host remaining. So there's quite a few questions on group supervision, which we haven't touched on yet. And Joanne, I might start with you by asking you your thoughts on how group supervision can help develop some of the aspects of child-focused practice that might be discussed in one-to-one supervision. What are its strengths and limitations?
Strengths and limitations of group supervision. Okay, I think, well, first of all, I think it's a fantastic forum and a really possibly enriching forum for colleagues to get together and really share resources, ideas and experience. I think that there needs to be a very clear understanding and agreement by everyone about what the purpose of the group supervision is, and what are the expectations of everyone present. So is there going to be a formal facilitator? Is it just going to be, oh, I'm struggling with this case and I'll just tell you about it and, give me your ideas? That sort of group supervision runs the risk of inviting opinion and telling, rather than being curious and asking the presenter about what the struggle is for them. So I'm probably a proponent of a more structured way of group supervision. I think a structure enables focus and purpose. The presenter needs to be given some time to prepare for group supervision so that they can think through, what are my stuck points? Why did I choose this particular family to present to everyone? And what is it that I am wanting from my colleagues in this forum? So I think some basic things like group agreements. What does respect mean? What does confidentiality mean? They need to be nutted out and written down and adhered to. What the presenter wants from the group and what they don't want from the group. So sometimes people do say, look, I actually am really stuck and I would like some questions that make me reflect, but I'd also like you to tell me what you might do in a similar situation. Other people might have different ideas. So I'm a proponent of a more structured approach to supervision to minimise that more reactive response, telling response, opinionated response.
Catherine and Sheila, I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on group supervision. I'll start with you, Catherine.
Look, I think I'm probably going to stick with what Joanne has said. I mean, I think it's such an important aspect to try and allow, I guess, opportunities for staff to be able to learn from their peers, because I think that is something that, you know, you can obviously gain a lot from the supervisor-supervisory relationship, but there is only two people in that container. Whereas when you expand out and you actually, you know, put yourself amongst colleagues and peers who also have their own ways of navigating and working in a best practice way, yeah, of course, you know, knowledge is only going to expand and grow from there. So I guess, yeah, for me, it would just be, I'm a proponent for it. I think we should do more of it and look for creative ways to really help people to stretch into, I guess, what feels a bit like out of their comfort zone. It feels like they're sort of being exposed a bit, but actually the rich depth of you know, practice, I suppose, that comes of it is really worthwhile. So yeah.
Yeah, some questions here, Julia. I suppose getting back to Joanne's some of Joanne's comments. How much does group supervision really depend on the group or the team really being on the same page in terms of what they believe about this?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a lot of kind of setup work that you might need to do, a bit like what Joanne was saying, to make this successful. And I also think it's a different skill set. I think it depends on our training, really. Some people are trained better in one-on-one, and other people have got good training in groups. And I think that we can't underestimate group skills to facilitate. It's a slightly different skill set. And I mean, like what you're saying, Catherine, when done well, it's really lovely. But I think the anxiety of the presenter can be kind of turned up by 10, because you've got, you know, there's that kind of peer stuff that's going on. What if they don't think I'm doing the right thing? I think that can be, what you don't want is unintended consequences of it being actually a really negative experience, and almost exposing of where people aren't always aligned. So I think it really is. I would absolutely agree with you, Joanne. It's all about the structure. It's all about getting the purpose. I've seen it done well. I've seen it done not so well. And when it's not done so well, it is in teams where there's not necessarily that safety, that pre-work hasn't been done, the structure's not there, the purpose is not clear. Where it's done well is that holding is held very expertly. And when it's done well, it looks easy. I think that's the other thing. You underestimate the kind of little duck legs working under the surface, but there's a lot of extra skills. I think the other thing that when it's done well, and again, I'm not saying anything new here, I actually think it's about being really clear about what the presenter, who's brave enough to kind of put themselves in a vulnerable position, sticking to what they want rather than what we think they want or what we think they need. And again, I think that's echoes a lot of the work we do with our clients, but I think it's just the sensitivities can get turned up a lot, so it does require a lot more setting up of that safety.
Thanks, Julia. Catherine, you mentioned before thinking about some templates that organisations and supervisors child-focused supervision. I'm wondering, can you talk maybe a little bit more in line with that around what practitioners can do themselves to prepare well for effective supervision when they go to meet their supervisor?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point that you raised, because I think often people assume, well, I've certainly had this experience where, you know, practitioners have come to supervision for their very first time and sort of plop down on the couch almost expecting that something's going to happen to them. And, you know, we really just need to sort of name that yeah, for people they've often had, sometimes have not had great experiences. So they come in with a lot of angst around, you know, what's to be expected. But I think ultimately what I always try to support practitioners to understand is that it's a mutual relationship. It's an ongoing dynamic that unfolds over time, but it's important that they take responsibility for the things that they want to be, you know, discussing and talking through. So I always would set that up, you know, in a supervision contract or agreement right from the outset, that both parties need to come with their own agenda items. And then that way, you know, the supervisee can prepare their own questions or topics or challenges that they want to unpack, rather than just sort of seeing it as a performance discussion that only requires like a general update. And I think that's what leads sometimes to feelings that supervision is almost like a tick and flick. and without any real substance or benefit. And like Joanne had beautifully described, that's kind of like that oxygen tank, that oxygen cylinder that it actually can be. But oftentimes people sort of feel like it feels more performative, like it's just actually a place they come and they just regurgitate what their case notes say, basically. And that's, you know, that doesn't create the depth and the opportunities for the rich, you know, knowledge, I guess, that can actually be born out of those discussions. So it is, yeah, a really important place for practitioners to come and to be well prepared for supervision, and to know that it is a place for critical reflection, but it's not actually all sitting on the supervisor's shoulders to take the heavy lifting role in order for that to actually transpire. It really is a mutual two-way relationship.
Thanks, Catherine. Joanne, a question for you from our audience. Thinking specifically about children's voices and children's preferences or concerns, are there ways that both supervisors and practitioners can use these preferences, voices and concerns in supervisory sessions to keep the process on track?
Yeah, great question, whoever wrote that. I think one of the things that I often think about after a session, and I might want to debrief with a colleague, I might start to talk about something and my colleague might say, "Oh, and did you say that?" And I said, "Oh no, I wasn't able to say that." And so when we have the voice, it might be a recording, or it might be that the supervisee has written down or just remembered some of the words or some of the interactions, and that's brought into the room. I think that really makes supervision come alive. So as Julia said, we actually need to be focusing on what our clients, or what is most important for the child. So if the child was sitting here in the room and they heard you say that, what meaning do you think they would make of that? So I would be asking questions of what the supervisee noticed about the child, when the child was being drawn in, when the child maybe was distracted or turning away, and what the supervisor felt they were able to do to bring that in the room. But I'm a real proponent of asking what was said, what were the words that the child actually used, or what was the behaviour that you noticed in the child? What do you think that they were trying to convey to you? So, you know, you can do that by an empty chair, you can do it by role play, you can do it by remembering what it is that the child was wanting to have different by coming to see you, and having that written down in front of you so that you stay on focus. So I think there's all of those things, and there's a lot more, but having the child's voice in the supervision room, I think, is really critical to maintain focus.
Thanks, Joanne. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. We are going to continue this conversation in another recorded session, answering some more of your questions, which will be available on the AIFS website a bit later. But for now, I just want to thank our presenters, Julia Oxley, Joanne Dunn and Catherine McLean, on some really nuanced and sophisticated answers to those questions. So thank you to all of you.
No problem.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks.
I also want to thank our audience. We just had such a plethora of amazing questions, which really, I think, goes to some of the considered thoughts that is happening in practice to make sure that supervision is quality and that it's child focused. Also like to thank Joe, Erin and Mel from the AIFS CFCA and comms team for making this webinar run smoothly. Thank you all. Just a reminder about the survey, the feedback survey. Please, if you've got a couple of minutes before you log off, please remember to fill that out. And just lastly, we have another webinar as part of the series between Emerging Minds and CFCA on the 25th of October, so not long now, actually, in a couple of weeks. And that's on supporting children's wellbeing when working with separating parents. So you can head either to the AVES or the Emerging Minds webinar for details on how to register for that one. I've really loved being able to bring our guests to you today and have this conversation. Really appreciate all of you tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Hi everybody, and welcome back to the extended Q&A part of our webinar, which is Supervision for Children's Wellbeing. Welcome back to Catherine, Joanne and Julia. Thanks for coming back and answering some more of our audience's questions. The first question is for you, Catherine, from our audience members who are wondering, picking up on some of your comments about what organisations can do. What are some of the strategies organisations can use to recruit, train and develop practitioners who already work in child-focused ways?
Yeah, sure. So look, it's important, I guess, to highlight that the strategies we would use to hire practitioners are also applicable for hiring of supervisors as well, because, you know, we really can't expect staff to be child aware or child focused if their supervisor isn't. But some of the ways I've done this previously in my roles as a supervisor and team leader is I've been really explicit right from the stage of the advertisement around the parameters of the role, really making it clear that it is child focused, that, you know, skills and experience in delivering family interventions are required, and then really ensured that the interview questions allow opportunity to drill into the applicant's own understanding of child focused practices. And I've also used this point of contact to really demonstrate how the organisation that I was working for upheld child-focused approaches and policies, as well as examples of how we were supporting this in practice through our learning and development activities and our foundational courses that we would have available for staff to embark on when they started. And so right from that stage of onboarding then, I've always put together really comprehensive onboarding plans, including the requirement for those foundational trainings, and Emerging Minds was one of the providers that we used, so that making sure that new staff could have that foundational learning in those first couple of months. And so in addition to that, all new staff were then buddied up with another staff member with strong child-focused practices for that on-the-job training. And then we would also use then the container of supervision to unpack and explore their understandings of the online trainings and their application into practice, as well as using reflective questions, from within the courses during peer supervision meetings to help support integration of their learnings. So those are just some of the ways that I guess I've worked previously with embedding child-focused practices at the stage of recruitment all the way through to onboarding.
Great, Catherine. Julia, a question for you from our audience goes back to this idea of reflective practice. And just wanting to hear a bit more about the strategies that you use to build strong supervisory relationships that actually allow for critical conversations and reflections to happen in a safe space.
I think I just wanted to kind of echo a bit of what Joanne and Catherine were saying before about some of the strategies they talk about. And I suppose I just wanted to overt in answering that is there's a couple of things. You want to be able to match the strategies with the developmental stage of the practitioner. So in the early stages of their supervision, they may be looking for answers. And I think someone mentioned that earlier, Joanne, you might have mentioned that earlier. So there's a real kind of want for them to get some real practical answers. And there's a temptation to provide that. And I think you need to kind of think about how you do that while still allowing them to kind of think about their own responses, think about what their own kind of thinking was, and almost slow it down a bit, a bit like the Michael Carroll stuff, that reflective kind of those frameworks that Joanne talked about beautifully earlier. And to be able to allow them to really explore and understand where they've come from. I think sometimes it's appropriate to give answers, but sometimes they have their own answers too. And I think it's holding that for them and asking questions in a curious way so that when you're providing kind of other ways of thinking about it, or some of those kind of reflective questions, it's not coming across from a position of criticism, but it's coming across from a just exploring possibilities, exploring kind of generally what's got in the way of being able to kind of take strategies that they might kind of know but not have confidence to step into. So holding that idea of curiosity, holding that idea of, let's just have a think about what this might, what this might mean, or what might be going on, allows for you both to not necessarily always have the right answers, and to have a bit of a safety in being able to say, well, if we had have done that, maybe there would have been an unintended consequences, or what about these options, and I'm wondering why this might not have happened that way. And it just allows for you to not necessarily be in a position of being the source of the truth. And I think that's the temptation, and that's sometimes where you feel pushed into as a supervisor, when there's a lot of anxiety coming from the supervision and the supervisee, but just being able to recognise and hold that back. Sometimes I'll even say, gee, it feels like this was a real sore spot for you, a real kind of, and talk about what that process might have been happening for them in their room. What did you notice? What did you feel? Allows for those conversations sometimes to take a different tact. And again, it's that same point that a few people mentioned earlier. Again, you're modelling that idea that you don't always get it right, and it's okay to not get it right, and it's okay just to use this place to explore different sort of responses and different avenues of thinking.
Great, thanks, Julia. Joanne, a question for you, and our final question. Can supervision or child-focused supervision make a distinct improvement or positive change in the way practitioners work, both with children and their families? Have you got examples where this has happened?
Well, I certainly hope so, because that's what we're all being paid to help develop. So, look, I think that the answer is very definitely, as I said before, this supervision is a space to refill our oxygen tanks, to re-energise, to review how full is my fuel tank at the moment, what do I need to do to bring it up to the fullest mark. So if, as both Julia and Catherine have said, supervision needs to have the focus of talking about whatever needs to be talked about for the better outcomes of the client, then yes, definitely. So I mentioned before about annual reviews at the end of the year about how supervision is going. However, really, the review needs to happen each time we meet. And so after every couple of supervisions, I might be noticing that there's a similar situation that's coming up with the supervisee, and they're describing it differently, or they appear different in their manner, in the way they talk about it. And as we unpack that, they say, I realise I'm a little bit more confident in this area. So I might be asking, well, what do you think your clients might be noticing about you that might be a little bit more different now, given this confidence, than, say, 3 months ago? And what does that mean to you? So I think getting our supervisees to feel that they are facilitating their own change, it's not just because of us, is really important. And I think that there's a really good resource on this. It's called the Pleased platform in the Dorothy Hewson toolkit, and it asks a lot of micro questions on what is going well, and what do you know? How do you know that things are going well? What was said? What was done? What was different? And so that's a very reflective way of asking into change, not just with the supervisee, but within the family. And I also think that unless we make space for our supervisees to reflect on what's going well and not just what they're struggling with, we're not going to be advancing through those stages of supervisory development that Julia talked about. So there has to be a degree of confidence and acknowledgement about the changes that we as supervisors are noticing and the way in which we invite our supervisees to notice that themselves.
Thanks so much, Joanne. That's all we have time for today. So again, join me in thanking our presenters, Catherine, Joanne and Julia. There's been some wonderful answers to some really great questions put forward by our audience. So thanks for all the questions. Thank you to all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.